Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege for me to welcome you all to this today's event, Regional Education Policy Dialogue, hosted by the Global Education Monitoring Report. As the Director for Education, Security and Culture at the SAARC Secretariat, I'm so excited to moderating today's event that convenes the representative of state and non-state across the region to discuss the 2022 South Asia report on non-state actors in education. As you all may aware, even though great strides have been made in improving school enrollment and completion in the South Asia, more than 50% of children learn in poverty, unable to read and understand a simple text by age 10. And 12.5 million children are at the primary level and 16.5 million children at the lower secondary level are out of school. Even before COVID-19 pandemic, millions of children complete primary education without mastering the foundational skills of basic numeracy and literacy, let alone 21st century's skills required for meaningful employment, personal well-being, and active participation in the society. South Asia has had highest youth population, not in any form of education, employment, or training in the world. These existing challenges in access to education and quality learning and skills have been exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, and the impacts of the crisis continue to disrupt the education of children and adolescents across the region. The new GEM report contains in-depth analysis from all SAARC member countries and provide a vital new tool for peer learning and dialogue for education policymakers. 8 country studies have fed into the report covering Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Iran, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. The regional report includes up-to-date information referencing COVID-19, noting that the region's private providers were particularly hit by the pandemics. Today's event will examine the new report's evidence-based recommendations for government across the region to ensure strong, equitable system for effective realization of SDG 4. Once again, welcoming all you and those of you joining online. I'm delighted to hand over to Priya Joshi, our co-moderator today and the lead author of the GEM report, before leading into some welcoming remarks from our host.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a bit short, so I hope you can see me from this angle. Thank you, Erosha. I echo what Erosha has said. We are so pleased and delighted to be here at this event, which really is aiming to foster peer learning and dialogue in the region on the issue of education in South Asia. This report's theme focuses on non-state actors involved in education. Just now, we've already started the conversation here. We define non-state actors quite broadly. We're talking about private schools, universities, philanthropic foundations, private tutoring centers, and many other non-governmental organizations, including, some of you who are represented here today. Non-state actors are a very broad field. We hope this discussion helps us showcase the partnerships we have already developed by working across experts from all countries in the region, and that this helps continue the generation of both new dialogues and discourses on the topic, and more broadly improves the progress towards SDG 4 in the region. Before we commence, I will briefly take you through the agenda for today's meeting and a few housekeeping rules. We will begin with welcome remarks by His Excellency Esela Ruwan Virakon, the Secretary General of SAARC, and a message from Mr. Michael Croft, UNESCO representative to Nepal and head of office. The morning session will focus on the 2022 South Asia report on non-state actors in education. We will begin this with a presentation of the 2022 South Asia report findings by our director, Mr. Manos, Dr. Manos Antoninis. This will be followed by a moderated session across the members of the South Asia partner organizations who will be joining us online, and who will call on them to share their perspectives on their research contributions, as well as their ideas on national and regional collaboration for impact. We will break for lunch, and then we begin our second session at 2 p.m. It will focus on SDG 4 benchmarks. This will include a presentation on setting and adoption of the national benchmarks for progress on SDG 4 and an interactive discussion. The third session, moderated by Director Correa, will focus on the importance of strengthening regional collaboration, and will end with an afternoon tea and network reception. So that's the agenda. On to housekeeping rules. Today's hybrid meeting is being recorded for internal purposes. Only certain excerpts may be shared online later. We'll have a series of interactive discussions, so do keep your questions in mind and perhaps, pose them at those moments, unless there's some really critical questions. If you're sharing any of the content presented online, please do make sure to use the hashtag #WriteTheRules. For those of you online, as usual, please keep your mics muted unless you're speaking, and feel free to keep your cameras on. And you can pose any questions directly in the chat. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to His Excellency Esela Ruan Virakon, Secretary General of SAARC, to deliver some welcome remarks.
Her Excellency Himali Arunatilaka, Ambassador of Sri Lanka, Mr. Umay Ali, Charge d'Affaires of the Embassy of Pakistan, Ms. Ishrat Jahan, DCM Bangladesh Embassy, members of the Diplomatic Corps, including the First Secretary of the Embassy of India, Mr. Manos Antoninis, Director, Global Education Monitoring Report, Mr. Michael Croft, UNESCO Representative, distinguished participants, colleagues from UNESCO and the SAARC Secretariat, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all. It is an honor for me to address the regional dialogue on the Global Education Monitoring Report convened by UNESCO. I join UNESCO in welcoming you all to this event. I thank UNESCO for choosing the SAARC Secretariat as the venue for this very important regional dialogue. UNESCO has been an active partner of SAARC and has been contributing significantly to the universal goal of educating all in South Asia. In this context, we were indeed honored to have been represented in the GEM Report's International Advisory Board, providing guidance and insights into critical areas of interest for the region. We are keen to further our collaboration with UNESCO in the days to come. As South Asia has the highest share of private institutions in total enrollment in the world, I am confident that the latest GEM regional report on non-state actors in education, which is the focus of today's dialogue, will be a valuable tool for policymakers across the region. It is the government which has the responsibility to fulfill the right to education of good quality for all. How governments fund and provide education influences the extent of non-state activity. Excellencies, distinguished participants, non-state actors in education in South Asia grew to meet demand and fill the lacunae. The desire for higher quality education closer to home, the call for English language education, the rise of a market for tutoring to make up for where schooling had failed and the need for quick solutions in times of crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which has changed our lives and livelihoods, all these play a part in the region's now diverse education system. There is a debate in South Asia about the value of private actors in education. The critical question this GEM report poses at this point is how governments can establish a just and effective oversight of the multiple actors, whether a school is run by the state, by a religious organization, or by the community. The report reminds us of the need to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all as enshrined in SDG 4. Well-designed partnerships between state and non-state actors within a facilitative regulatory framework supported by necessary political commitment can help optimize the functions of education as a public good. State and non-state partnerships can be meaningfully fostered through regular dialogue. Distinguished participants, education systems are like living things which expand and retract, absorbing innovations, welcoming new actors, responding to labor market trends and community demands over time. Several countries in the region have responded to this change, creating regulatory environments that are more flexible and less restrictive, and that allow innovation to prosper. However, as with any fast-paced developments, there is a risk that change may overtake capacity for control. Regulations, this report reminds us, lay the basic rules reflecting the core values of the objectives of our Sustainable Development Agenda. When designed and enforced effectively, they keep all actors in check. We are mindful of the fact that the rise of non-state actors in education has expanded access to education more rapidly in South Asia in the past 3 decades than the rest of the world. This report provides useful insights for governments to ensure that their choices in the system prioritize and fund solutions that will help those furthest behind. The report asks governments in the region to consider who loses when choices of different forms of education are made available and how we can ensure that their right to a quality education is not put at risk. Distinguished participants, the report is an important reference document for policymakers to take a reflective view of the status quo and make sure that both equity and quality do not escape our attention. Today's regional dialogue allows representatives from across the region to come together to compare experiences. We look forward to learning more about the report from the discussions that will follow this opening session. I once again thank UNESCO for this timely and important initiative and wish the distinguished participants fruitful discussions. I wish this regional dialogue every success. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for your encouraging and insightful remarks. Now we will play a short video message from UNESCO representative to Nepal and head of office, Mr. Michael Croft, who unfortunately is traveling elsewhere in the region at present and wasn't able to join us today.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Michael Croft. I'm the UNESCO representative to Nepal. And first, my apologies for not being with you in person today. I'm actually, at this moment, on Mount Everest, or Sagarmatha as it's known here, conducting a series of dialogues with local communities about the future of sustainable development on this most important natural world heritage site. Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's regional dialogue, convened by the Global Education Monitoring Report, UNESCO's flagship education publication. Today is an opportunity for representatives from South Asian countries to come together to reflect on common challenges and identify shared solutions to one of the most critical issues currently facing leaders concerned with education policy and practice. Today, there is no part of education in which non-state actors are not involved, and their role extends far beyond the provision of schooling, affecting the textbooks the children use, the food in their canteens, the additional support they receive, and the skills they learn after they leave school, and so much more. Today, South Asia stands out as the region with the highest share of private enrollment. So I think that we can agree that the 2022 South Asia report provides a timely contribution to policymakers across the region who look for guidance in the new educational landscape in the aftermath of the global pandemic, during which the non-state actor and the non-state sectors have played a prominent role. We can recall that during the launch of Agenda 2030 in 2015, governments committed to provide 1 year of free pre-primary and 12 years of free primary and secondary education. Unfortunately, this has not been realized, and as a result, education is costly for families, with households increasingly burdened by expenditures due to inadequate government financing. With this in mind, the report's recommendation ensure that equity in education is foremost in our minds when discussing education financing, quality, governance, innovation, and policymaking. Over the course of today's discussion, you will hear from education experts and policymakers working to make the most of state and non-state actors' contributions to deliver education of quality, but not at the cost of inequality. The aim is to highlight and harness the contributions that non-state actors can make to help governments achieve their agenda and find innovative solutions that can build inclusive education systems for all learners. And we will hear more about the recommendations shortly from my colleague Manos, who's the director of the GEM report. Dear friends, as the lead agency for coordinating SDG 4, UNESCO recognizes the importance of engaging non-state actors to achieve our development goals, spelled out in the Framework for Action. This includes working in partnership with regional organizations such as SAARC, whose nuanced understanding of the regional context plays a critical role in fostering peer learning and dialogue and supporting countries to work together toward a shared goal and a common agenda. Indeed, the launch of the new GEM report, the regional report especially, provides a critical moment for us all to reflect on what common parameters and principles to ensure that all education actors support progress towards SDG 4 and the fulfillment of the right to education. I can't think of a more timely or more topical discussion to be having. I wish you all the very best. Thank you very much, and please enjoy.
Before we begin the first session of the day, I would like to invite the director of the GEM report, Mr. Manoth Antoninis, to present the 2022 South Asia Regional Report to His Excellency, Mr. Asala Ruanvirako.
Thank you, Manos. Thank you, Your Excellency. As moderator of the morning session, we now turn to the topic of the role of non-state actors in education. We launched the South Asia Regional Report on November 2nd and have had a series of events in India, Pakistan, and in Nepal, culminating in this regional engagement at the SAARC Secretariat. This report really was a tremendous opportunity for us at the GEM report to collaborate with expert partners from across the region. Over the remainder of the morning session, we'll touch upon some of the critical arguments of our report. Without further ado, let's first watch a short video to set the scene for today's event. While the report covers a wide variety of topics, this video zooms in on parental voices regarding their choices, aspirations, and burdens, and our hopes from school choice. Thank you.
वो चीज़ सोच के हम बच्चों को आज अच्छे से अच्छा एजुकेशन देना चाहते हैं, पढ़ाई देना चाहते हैं, पढ़ लें, कहीं पे भी जाके घबराए नहीं वो, जैसे हम घबरा जाते हैं आजकल।
What becomes very important is understanding that non-state actors come in all shapes and sizes. They're doing very different things. For the system, we have to recognize that equity is a very important consequence of education sort of fragmentation and diversification.
They know the education is the passport for becoming anything. So they choose school which is in their vicinity, which has the competition in their DNA, which take care of their children's aspiration.
अभिभावक भएर हामीले सोच्ने भनेको हामी सरकारी स्कुलमा बच्चा पढाउने भनेको मध्यम वर्गीय र निम्न वर्गीयका अभिभावकहरूले सरकारी स्कुल रोज्ने हो। त्यसले गर्दाखेरि हामीलाई खर्चले ठुलो चाहिँ रोल खेल्छ, किनभने हाम्रो आफ्नो आर्थिक अवस्था अनुसार नै स्कुल छनौट गर्नुपर्ने अवस्था हुन्छ। त्यसले गर्दाखेरि सरकारीमा हामीले नानी आफ्ना छोराछोरी पढाइसकेपछि हामी सरकारी स्कुलमै पढाउने हाम्रो चाहना हुन्छ, किनभने सरकारले 12 कक्षासम्म निःशुल्क शिक्षा भनेको कारणले गर्दा नि कमसेकम हाम्रो पालामा त्यो अप्सन चाहिँ थिएन। हामी जुन स्कुल थियो त्यो स्कुलमा पढ्नुपर्ने बाध्यता थिए। अब अहिले त हामी सरकारी स्कुलहरू पनि छानी छानी पढ्न पाइन्छ। कुन स्कुल राम्रो छ, अहिले सरकारी स्कुल भने कुन स्कुलमा ल्याब छ, कुन स्कुलमा लाइब्रेरी छ।
जहाँ पहले जाती थी वो उर्दू मीडियम था और मैं इंग्लिश मीडियम में भी पढ़ना चाहती थी और कुछ सब्जेक्ट ऐसे थे जो स्किप थे, तो मैं चाहती थी कि मैं वो भी पढूं। तालीम हासिल करने का शौक है मुझे, तो फिर मैं गवर्नमेंट स्कूल आ गई।
आज के टाइम में इंग्लिश से बढ़कर कुछ है ही नहीं। अब से तो आपने अभी तो कुछ पेट काट के भी हो, कुछ भी हो, बच्चों को तो पढ़ाई नहीं है ना। ट्यूशन पढ़ाई के लिए और अच्छा होए, उसके बेस और अच्छा बने। हम जितना भी अच्छा होए उतना कोशिश करेंगे ना बच्चों के लिए, तो उनको जो चीज़ समझ में नहीं आता वहाँ जाके समझ लेते हैं, तो उसके लिए फायदा ही है हमारे लिए। इसको ऐसे ऑफर तो बहुत भारी है, लेकिन क्या करें, बच्चे के देखने से
जो बच्चों को पढ़ाना है, अच्छा एजुकेशन देना है, आगे अच्छा भविष्य मिले ताकि।
Schooling is so linked in South Asia to what you can pay and where you live. There is a responsibility of the state sector to recognize that it has to improve its government capacities, its quality of education. The hope is that school choice actually becomes a way to look at different options for life and society rather than a way to keep the segregation in society going. We will now turn to the GEM Report Director, Manos Antoninis, who will take us through the findings of the South Asia Regional Report.
Thank you, Priya. Your Excellency, Secretary General, representatives of the country's diplomatic representations, colleagues from the development community, colleagues from, of course, the SAARC Secretariat. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Before we begin with the slides, a couple of words about the Global Education Monitoring Report, which I imagine for most of you is quite a new concept, even though the report is celebrating its 20th anniversary. It was established in 2002 to be the tool of the international community to monitor progress on education in the international development agenda. And this initial experiment, let's say, was well received to the extent that in 2015, at the dawn of the new development agenda, it received the official mandate this time from the world's governments to continue doing this task, monitoring progress on education in the SDGs. Every report has a review of all the SDG 4 targets and aspects related to its relationship with the rest of the agenda and also on finance, but also to monitor the implementation of national and international strategies to achieve SDG 4. And that's why we have a theme in every report. And the theme of the 2022 report, as you know, was the role of non-state actors in education. We are an editorially independent report hosted and published by UNESCO and funded by quite a wide range of primarily government actors. I don't know if we can move to the presentation so that I can take you through. The first thing to note is that every global report is not just the report itself. It's accompanied by a summary that is translated in multiple languages, including many South Asian languages, and an edition dedicated to gender issues, an edition on youth. And since 2019, we have introduced also a regional edition. And this is the one that we are presenting today that was launched just a few days ago. And it's South Asia is the next in a series of regional reports that we presented in 2019. We started with Arab states and the topic of migration and displacement, the region of the world most affected by this phenomenon. In 2020, we had the theme of inclusion that was examined in two regions. First, in Latin America and the Caribbean, because it is the region that is the most unequal in the world. And then in the so-called former transition countries, Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia, that had a very particular way of excluding learners with disabilities from the system. And we documented how countries moved in this direction of including all of them in the education system. So as you see, we select the region we focus because there is a special relevance in relation to the topic of the global report. Looking forward, 2023 is the focus on technology in education. We will be having a regional report on Southeast Asia in collaboration, as all regional reports essentially have been, with partners, this time with SIMEO, the Southeast Asia Ministers of Education Organization, to some extent a little bit of your sister organization in that part of the world. And we also know the theme of the 2024 report, which is on leadership in education, where we will cover all levels of leadership from school all the way to the political leadership, but also those people who act outside the education system, what we called non-state actors, which I know that is a term that is not always clear. In some countries, it's misunderstood, but you will see immediately why this broad term was used. Maybe just to say, as you see from the bottom part of this slide, this report was done in partnership, a very successful partnership with 6 organizations, at least 6 organizations, because others were also involved in many ways, from different countries in the region. And that's why we were particularly keen to partner also with SAARC to demonstrate the possibilities, the opportunities that do exist for regional cooperation and work. And we're very grateful to our partners, BRAC in Bangladesh, Center for Policy Research and Central Square Foundation in India, IIDS here in Nepal, the Institute for Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, and finally, Idara Talim Agahi from Pakistan, who states the course of the collaboration in what we know is a difficult region to collaborate, but also considering the very diverse perspectives on a theme that we know generates a lot of passion, political passion about the advantages and disadvantages of the role of non-state actors in education. Now, let's see, and let's start from the big question. Why did we really engage with South Asia on this particular topic? This is the result of a study that we conducted for the report. It's very unusual to have evidence for this question from anywhere but the richest countries in the world. Adults were asked about their opinions, among many other things, on who they thought or whether they thought the government should carry the primary responsibility for delivering education. And as you see from this graph, 9 out of 10 adults in upper middle income and high income countries believe that it is the government's responsibility to deliver this service. But you see some cracks emerging in the 2 lower middle income countries. The Philippines, where only 6 in 10 parents thought so. And in India, the only South Asian country that was included in that sample, where, to our great surprise, less than 1 in 2 parents, or less than 1 in 2 adults believe that was the case. And to some extent, we believe that this is a perspective that's probably widely represented across the region. It's not just in South Asia, and not just in India. And that set us on course to examine why is this the case. And of course, this also reflects the reality, as you already heard from the intervention so far. The next 2 slides have 2 pairs of graphs that show the percentage of private institutions in total enrollment at 4 levels of education, starting from pre-primary education, which actually is the odd one out when it comes to South Asia, because South Asia, the share of private institutions is lower than the global average. You see here the graph goes back 50 years, which enables us to take the long-term historical perspective, which also shows that in fact nothing is predetermined. Things change out of a combination of social, economic, and political forces, and of course ultimately policy decisions. In South Asia, the amount, the percentage, the share of private institutions in pre-primary education was extremely high, but sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, primarily, as you know, most trends in South Asia are affected by India, given the population size. The government decided to invest in rural pre-primary education and care services, and that's why you saw how this share plummeted, the so-called Angawadi centers. But you also see that in the last 10 years, this share is rapidly increasing. But coming to the right-hand side, primary education, you see that the share of South Asia is, in fact, the highest in the world, reaching almost 40%, and it is double the share in the rest, or more than double the share in the rest of the world. But also, it's the part of the world where private institutions have expanded the fastest. You see different, of course, contexts within the region. In Sri Lanka, the share is the lowest. In Bangladesh, Pakistan, they're close to the regional average. So primarily, again, the trend has been determined by India, but not only by India. Looking at secondary education, you see, again, South Asia is the region of the world with the highest share of enrollment, exceeding 40%. Again, variation. Bangladesh is an exception in the sense that the secondary school education system was never quite nationalized, even though, as you will see, it's very heavily government subsidized. Finally, in tertiary education, South Asia is the second highest region. Latin America and the Caribbean is the share where is only slightly higher. We don't see great variation in trend, but we also don't have, unfortunately, data for a very long time to see how that has developed. But you see that even in the countries with the lowest share, like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, the share has been growing rapidly. Now, that is the overall average picture. In reality, things are far more nuanced when we start looking at the details. This infographic at the top right reminds us that, first of all, schools are being established by non-state actors for very different reasons, very different motivations. Some because they really want to make a difference, to bring disadvantaged children to school, to test some new pedagogy, altruism, dedication to some education cause. Others see education as an opportunity for profit making, as a business activity. And others see it as a matter of values. They want to inculcate religious values in particular, and that, of course, is prominent in many countries also in the region. Now, establishing a school is one step. The next question, as the second layer shows, is that every school has different relationships with the state. To what extent the state owns partly or not, the school manages it partly or not, or funds it to a lesser or no extent. And finally, it's the bottom level of the price that children and families have to pay. And again, we have a very wide range. We have schools where children pay nothing or families pay nothing, schools where families pay low fees, and of course, we have the elite schools where the costs are impossible to afford for the vast majority of families. So looking at examples of this variation, because all of these characteristics are also interplaying with each other, making it extremely diverse landscape, not only South Asia, but almost everywhere in the world. In terms of motivation, in Pakistan, 9% of enrollments in private and secondary schools are in religious institutions. The same amount, the same share was also reached in Bangladesh by NGO schools up until the 2000, when there was a massive movement to education that was provided by these actors, supporting primarily rural areas and disadvantaged areas. And this, though, has changed. Now, the share is less than half that size, around 4%, because the government gradually absorbed these institutions. And in Sri Lanka, there has been a massive expansion of English medium international schools in the last decade, to which I'm going to return, even though, as you'll see in the bottom hand side graph, it's still a very small part of the big picture. So this bottom hand, left-hand side graph shows the distribution of enrollment in private and secondary schools by different varieties of public and private actors. The gray bar is the standard public government school that we know. You see it's highest in Sri Lanka and in Bhutan and Afghanistan. Then you have, at the opposite ends, the red bar, which is private schools that receive no support from the state. And here, India and Pakistan are leading, with 1 in 3 students attending such schools. But you also have other examples. For instance, the highlighted part of the bar is in Bangladesh, where schools receive, primary, secondary schools receive the support of the state in terms of paying salaries. Finally, you also see, and the report documents, I will not go into detail here, vast variance of fees that households pay. But as you heard from the interventions so far, if I could turn it, and maybe you could point there. Oh, it's not just the delivery of education that matters. Non-state actors are engaging in many other ways with the education system. The first and obvious, and perhaps what many describe as an elephant in the room, is private tutoring. In Sri Lanka, the share of families, rural families that were attending, were receiving or paying for private tutoring services or coaching services increased from 19 to 62% in just a period of 20 years. And as you see in the right-hand side, the graph from Pakistan shows how this percentage evolves by grade from primary to secondary education for families that live in urban or rural areas and those that attend public or private schools. And you see, and perhaps counterintuitively, but it was also reflected in the video, that it is mainly urban families whose children attend private schools that have the highest attendance rate in private tutoring, 60% at grade 10 in Pakistan, which is interesting about how families conceive, because often we talk about the quality and families trying to compensate for the quality in public schools, but in fact, that's not reflected in this graph, and makes us think a little bit more about the nature of the phenomenon. Textbooks in this country, private publishers are responsible for printing and distributing textbooks in primary education. And of course, there's a lot of involvement in curriculum development by non-state actors, which is also touched upon in the report. Education technology, of course, saw a massive expansion during COVID in India. More money, more than $2 billion was invested just in 2020, which is more than what had been invested in the 10 years before. We know that this industry has received some battering since then, but still it has made a huge impact on the perception of education. And let's not forget that all these factors, tutoring, textbooks and learning materials preparation, and education technology, are now increasingly being presented as a package, a new phenomenon that was not really existing before. The report reviews the 3 main reasons why different actors are arguing in favor or against private education. These are cost efficiency, the idea of innovation and quality, and equity. But as you heard also from Priya, this report has put primarily emphasis on equity and inclusion, because we felt that this is a dimension that has not received sufficient attention. And inevitably, private education is in fact the immediately or first benefiting those who are most well off. The graph here on the right-hand side is about early childhood education patterns, the distribution of children. In the graph, you see the gray bar, which is those children not attending, the red bar, which is those attending private preschools, and the blue bar, which is those attending public preschools. And you see that the wealthiest 20% is 7 times more likely, or at least was a few years ago, 7 times more likely to attend a private preschool than those from the poorest 20%. There are also differences in fee levels paid. The richest households in India and Pakistan pay 3 or 4 times higher fees than the poorest. In Pakistan in particular, we would need to move children out of some schools into other schools, almost 40% of them, to ensure that there would be an equal distribution in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, given the current situation. Coming to the second argument, quality and innovation. The report argues that good ideas in education and innovative ideas are not just the preserve of only one set of actors, non-state actors, as it's often portrayed. In fact, there is a variety of initiatives and we should recognize that. Yes, it is absolutely true that NGOs have been particularly at the forefront of good ideas of improving, especially the situation for disadvantaged children. In Bangladesh, for instance, NGOs have been particularly active in supporting refugee communities with innovative ideas about play-based learning. But when you look at India, play-based learning is more likely to be found in public institutions, whereas in private institutions, parents have to are putting pressure on the private schools to deliver more academic results. And of course, we know that play-based learning is more important. The same is the case also with language. As you heard, private institutions tend to put more emphasis on English because they think that's what parents want, even though we know that pedagogically, it's not the appropriate solution for young children. Teachers tend to be better qualified in public schools because private schools tend to employ young, female, unqualified, or teachers who are just about to receive their qualifications and have very limited experience. Although we know that in practice, they deliver almost the same levels of quality of education in terms of the measurable outcomes. And that's another important issue. Infrastructure tends to be better in private schools. Private unaided schools were 5 times more likely to have internet than public schools. However, we should not also forget that public schools are far more likely to have facilities that are suitable for learners with disabilities, ramps, for instance. The big question, and that's, I think, quite a big focus for this report, is learning outcomes. There are, of course, a lot of measures which tell us that private schools deliver better education than public schools because the results in exams are so. But when we control in research for the characteristics of the learners, we find that actually this difference disappears. In rural Pakistan, there's no difference really between public and private schools when you take into account that it is mainly richer students who attend private schools. In India, it's cut by about half. And that next graph actually tells us a little bit more about that and provides food for thought. When we look at this, the statistic is the global SDG 4 indicator on learning outcomes. How many children achieve minimum levels of proficiency in reading and mathematics. I'll focus on the reading part. You see it's a trend between 2000 and 2020. And first at the top, you see that's about students at the end of lower secondary education. About 41% achieve that minimum level of proficiency globally. But when you take into account the fact that 3 in 4 students only reach that level, in fact, only 1 in 3 achieve this level. In South Asia, it's 1 in 5. However, it's not the differential between the global and the regional level that should be your focus. It's the fact that in South Asia, levels of learning have not improved faster than the rest of the world. In fact, a bit slower than in the rest of the world, which reminds us that despite this massive transition of students from public to private schools, in fact, we have not seen any major impact at the learning outcomes level. Now let's focus on policy. Regulations are, of course, the potential solution to this situation. The report reviewed regulations of private education in more than 200 countries. and also in more depth in South Asia. These results are available in our website called PEER. The results show that countries tend to focus primarily on entry and exit, the establishment of schools, so the registration, approval, affiliation conditions, much less so on equity and quality. Fees are commonly regulated, less so in tertiary education, where only half the countries have fee controls, fee level controls, or fee increases controls, or regulations about how universities should spend their fees in what types of activities. We also see that there are very few regulations when it comes to activities outside schooling. In Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka, no licensing or registration is required to set up a private tutoring business, which means that the sector is mostly unregulated. Oops. Of course, regulations are viewed differently from different actors. Depends who you ask. If you ask the governments, often governments in the region say that private providers tend to ignore regulations. In Nepal, for instance, they were shown to have resisted paying a 5% tax, or in providing, or they continued making fee increases that were not really regulated. But at the same time, if you ask the providers, they focus on very different aspects. They say that the government lacks capacity and also does not trust the services that they provide. In India, Nepal, and Pakistan, providers complain about the complexity of the regulations that were available. In Delhi, in particular, multiple certificates and approvals from multiple government departments were required. So a process that should take no more than 4 months often takes as much as 5 years. Regulation limitations, the way they're formulated, also fuel corruption. In Telangana state, 80% of low-fee private schools claimed that they had paid more for their registration than what was officially prescribed. And fragmented education systems are also not helping. You remember I mentioned the Sri Lankan English medium international schools, which actually are not considered officially as schools. They are companies monitored not by the Ministry of Education, but by a business ministry, which is, of course, not conducive to a unified system. And that is ultimately the key message of this report. Finally, on financing, we see that there are quite a few cases of government funding private schools. They're not really, though adequate enough in terms of volume, and often such support arrives late. In Pakistan, providers claim that the $3 to $9 per child that they receive in terms of support in some part of the system that is government aided is not adequate to cover their needs. In Bangladesh, the monthly pay order system, which is the teacher salary payment subsidies to secondary private schools, is also not considered sufficient to improve quality. And finally, these schools are often very precariously situated with very few means. What we observed, this graph is from India, is that as a result of COVID-19, there was a shift back from private schools to public schools. As you see, the share of government schools increased from 64 to 70% in rural India in just a period of the 2 years of the pandemic. Similar observations can be made also for Pakistan. Now, with these findings overall, we're moving to the last few slides on the recommendations. The recommendations of the report urge governments in the region to look at the education system as a whole. There should be no differences between public and private schools. All institutions, all students, all teachers should enjoy the same conditions. There should be no pockets of advantage or of exploitation. So the first recommendation is actually not a recommendation per se, it's a reminder that governments committed in 2015 to deliver 1 year of pre-primary and 12 years of primary and secondary education free of charge for all. In reality, we have as you know, familiar problem of domestic revenue mobilization in South Asia. This graph at the bottom left shows on the horizontal axis how much countries raised in tax as a percentage of GDP in 2000 and how much they raised in 2020. So every country that is above the diagonal line has made some progress in the last 20 years. And although South Asian countries have made progress, you also see at the same time that they are at the bottom of domestic revenue mobilization efforts. If you don't raise enough resources, then it's inevitable that you won't be able to pay for these services. And what happens is what you see on the right-hand side. Unfortunately, South Asia has the unenviable, let's say, qualification of being the region of the world where households pay the most for education. 38% of the total education cost comes from households. And as you see in the graph, 7 out of the 8 countries in the region have a share of households in total education spending that is above the global average. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, households pay more than the government does for delivering education. And we see throughout the region, 13% of families had to save, 8% had to borrow money to pay for their school fees, for something that should have been, of course, free of charge. The second recommendation is about setting equal quality standards that apply to all institutions, whether they are state or non-state. Standards should cover not just inputs, but also outcomes and processes. We should also make sure that teachers are valued as professionals equally in all schools, yet we see vast quality differentials between institutions. Quality assurance mechanisms should be in place, and private tutoring should not be allowed to negatively impact on the education system. However, in countries around the region, Nepal is just mentioned as an example, teachers who offered tutoring services in school were then covering less material in school than because they were covering additional material during their tutoring practices. Progress is possible, but requires some political will. In the case of TVET, Technical and Vocational Education and Training, India's National Skills Development Corporation, which was meant to support the expansion of such services, started with a lot of problems. However, the government realized those, and in 2015 showed the need for aligning interests and objectives, and has led to some progress in that respect. The third recommendation is similar. Once we have common standards, we also need to have common support and monitoring systems between the state and non-state sector. A clear vision should be adopted in engaging non-state actors, especially on issues of equity. Tutoring I mentioned, but also selective admissions or fee levels. All education providers should be regulated as private entities, and yet we saw that many are currently not. It's very important for their regulations to be simple and transparent, and therefore efficient. As you see in the cartoon, sometimes our regulations appear as if the law is lecturing providers what to do. In fact, they should be seen as partners. As a result, many institutions, in Pakistan, just one example, remain unregistered. 18% of primary and 14% of lower secondary school were unregistered because the process was so cumbersome, or they are not comprehensive. Private schools in the Punjab province of Pakistan were generally regulated, but they also delivered pre-primary services which were left outside the regulatory framework. So it is very important to build a relationship of trust with non-state providers and invite their participation in the development of policies and, of course, regulations in particular. The final recommendations relates to the concept of innovation and policy making. I mentioned before, we should make sure that we should remember that good ideas come from anywhere in the system. It's not the preserve of one actor, and it should not be the commercial preserve of any one actor. Governments are required to identify, to search, first of all, identify, test, and finally ensure that the good ideas are delivered in all education institutions and not just in some. And finally, we need to maintain the transparency, inclusion, and integrity of public education policy processes. We need to give all voices equal chance to be heard in this preparation of policy. The cartoon there, of course, also reminds us that it's important to monitor and safeguard against lobbying and revolving door policies when it comes to policy development. That brings my presentation to the end. I would like to thank you very much for coming here this morning, and I'm looking forward to the next part of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Manus. This regional report has actually been in development for over 2 years. And as Manus mentioned, since we looked at these issues quite comprehensively globally, one of the core goals with the regional report was to engage with partners to provide their expert opinions and use their networks and reach to hear from different stakeholders. Our partners were also of tremendous help in contextualizing the messages and recommendations. Before I introduce the panel, I would like us to share a short video from the partners.
The Regional Report Project is a project to study the role of non-state actors in the region and to provide some ideas on how we might move forward together in developing a better relationship between the public and the private sector.
The main factor that contributed to the increase in non-state involvement in education has been widespread failures in state capacity in providing public education. And I think the UNESCO report and the South Asia report in particular brings this out very clearly.
The most important to understand is that education is expensive and governments are trying to allocate as much as they can within broad financial constraints, which all the South Asian countries are in, and certainly Nepal is in. The role of the private providers, the non-state actors in providing education, is extremely important.
It was quite a complex task because we were looking at non-state activities in education in a variety of dimensions. Plus, we were looking at all levels of education. So starting with pre-primary, primary, secondary, tertiary, vocational training, and adult learning.
But more and more, we are finding non-state participation extending into areas of supplementary services, whether it be teacher training, textbook publication, midday meals, and even more, I think, now in setting the policy agenda.
The major challenge now is to look at the whole system in a holistic way. It is not working perfectly now. There are many problems, but there are potentials here for broadening this area of partnership.
Pakistan, as many countries of the South, have been suffering from too many children not being able to read. It's that which is at the core of equity. It's that which is being denied to the children. And I think that needs to be delivered at every cost.
To highlight the message that calls for a common system and common standards across private and public schools on learning. And we plan to use the attention that the report brings to the non-state system to ask for such a system to be instituted.
I think more debate, more communication, more healthy discussion across state and non-state is very important so that the children of Pakistan are entitled and are given quality education, which is their fundamental right.
It has to be all students, all institutions, all contributors working together to achieve the common public good functions of education for the country.
You saw them all on video, and now we will see them all online again. I'm pleased to this is going to be a moderated panel discussion. It aims to highlight the contributions and reflections of the research leads from several of the studies conducted through this throughout the region. As we know, partnerships are made with people and not just institutions. So let me first start by introducing Mr. Rahul Aliwalia, who's Project Director, Central Square Foundation. He leads the governance work at the Central Square Foundation. Dr. Manzoor Ahmed is Professor Emeritus at BRAC University, Bangladesh, and was formerly Senior Advisor and Founder Director of the Institute of Education Development at BRAC. He has been part of several pioneering efforts in Bangladesh, including on non-formal education, early childhood, and rural transformation. Ms. Kiran Bhatti is Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, India. She's an expert who researches governance issues in elementary education, working to build systems of transparency, accountability, and community monitoring. Ms. Seher Saeed is Deputy Director of Research at Idara-e-Talim o Agahi, ITA, Pakistan. She oversees large-scale surveys, service delivery programs, and impact evaluations, working closely with CEO Bela Jamil, who is an expert on education in Pakistan and serves on multiple national and global boards. And Dr. Nisha Arunatilake is Director of Research and Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. She has extensive experience in conducting policy-related economic research in labor market analysis, education, public finance, and health. She has the Labor Employment and Human Resource Development Unit at IPS. Please join me in welcoming them. To each of the panelists, since it's all online, we have a set of questions, and I would ask the panelists to keep it relatively brief. And we'll start with Rahul. I would like you to ask you to make some national and regional comments. First, by just, let us just try to understand briefly the situation in your countries. Could you give a short take on what are the important issues in education in your country, and what are the main issues regarding how non-state actors are involved in education?
Thank you, Priya. First of all, let me congratulate the GEM team on an absolutely wonderful work of scholarship, which I hope will help us in this discussion. I think in India, as Manos already pointed out, almost a third of children attend non-state schools. Substantially, the major problem has been quality of education in the last 15 to 20 years, since enrollment, I think, is close to 100% levels. After COVID, I think that would have changed slightly, but quality of education is what we at Central Square Foundation are most focused on. And I think Manos also earlier pointed out that it's true that quality is low in South Asia, in India, but what is worrying is that over time, improvement in quality has not been seen. And I think that actually directly takes me to the point of what is it in India that we would focus on for non-state actors. It is that a measure of learning quality is actually missing from the non-state system to a large extent, right? I think, as pointed out earlier in the GEM report also, the regulations that exist tend to focus very much on inputs and operations, right? And not so much on how much do the children learn there. And in terms of providing accountability to the parents that send their children to these schools, sometimes at great personal cost, we think that this is one of the biggest gaps that exists within the ecosystem, right? So there needs to be an independent measure of learning for children in both systems, right? Both public and private. I think Manos once again very clearly brought out that it's been huge failures of state capacity that underpin this shift of parents from the public systems to the private systems. And it is our view that even this lack of state capacity exists in the first place because outcomes are not visible to parents, and hence the appropriate incentives do not exist for people to improve on learning. I'll pause here. Is there more that I could have covered or not, or that you would want me to cover?
Thank you, Rahul. I would like to ask Dr. Ahmed, Mansoor Ahmed, to please respond to the same question. A short take on what are the important issues in your country and what are the main issues regarding how non-state actors are involved. From Rahul, of course, we heard one of the more sort of consistent discourses on non-state actors.
Thank you very much, Priya. Greetings from Bangladesh. I'm delighted that this event is happening with the involvement of SAARC. We would certainly like to see SAARC as the regional organization for South Asia cooperation become more involved in sharing and exchanging ideas and knowledge, including in the field of education. We hope that we'll see more of this in the future. Now, from this study that we all have been involved in, I think we can see clearly some distinctive features for this region, for South Asia region. And these are also reflected in our country, in Bangladesh. One of the things, of course, is I think the overwhelming challenge that we face now is that we are not on track to achieve SDG 4 2030, to which all of our countries are committed. We have passed more than half of the time period from 2015 to 2030, and we have fallen behind. And it is not just because of the COVID. Of course, the COVID setback has been a major setback, but even before COVID, we were not on track to achieve the 2030 goal of, what are the goals? Basic education from pre-primary to secondary level at least, achieved for all, inclusive and of quality, and free, that is affordable to all. And this, and also the lifelong learning opportunities to be expanded. And this is not happening. So why? Now, I think some of the reasons are very evident. We just have not made enough investment in education in our region here. All of the countries are at fault in this respect, including Bangladesh. Particularly, Bangladesh is probably one of the countries which is at the bottom of the list of public investment in education globally. It has been around 2% of GDP and around 10–11% of government budget for education. So this is the situation, and this opens up the opportunity for non-state actors to sort of fill the gap. And this filling the gap in the best interest of achieving equitable and quality education for all children. And the government, first of all, not providing the necessary investment and not having an overall view of the system and a regulatory and partnership and collaboration mechanism that can bring all actors together to achieve the goal. So this is a general situation in the region, but also in Bangladesh, particularly so, I would say, in Bangladesh. There are these structural issues and there are operational governance issues. I think we probably have not focused or emphasized enough in our regional report the governance issues in terms of two kinds here. One is, roles at the national level, subnational level, and institutional level, how these can be defined and carried out in a way that the goals are, the learning outcomes are achieved. And secondly, I think, which has been alluded to, the regulatory mechanism, the overall view of taking a holistic view and bringing all actors together. There also, again, a governance issue here, and they are not brought together. And then maybe thirdly also, the public sector governance in our region not just education, any public sector governance is not working very well. All kinds of problems, capacity problems, accountability problems, transparency problems, and corruption, mismanagement problems. So education sector, public sector also suffer from that. So while we want a larger role, more proactive role of the government in education itself, providing services and bringing in the other actors together within a common framework, but then the governance capacity and governance functioning effectively, if this doesn't improve, then of course the challenge remains how we can take a framework that would work, the regulatory framework to work. We have to the governance capacity, and the accountability and transparency, and also the controlling the corruption and inefficiencies, and even probably a culture of impunity. People get away with things that should not happen. So this is general problem in our region, also problem in our country, in Bangladesh. So these are challenges. Now, I think maybe another thing that we talked about it in the regional report, but maybe not emphasized enough, is when we talk about quality of education, along with other things, the investment and the governance and so on, it is the role and responsibility and capability of the teachers. It's the teachers who can make a difference in the quality. It's the teachers who are the intermediary, which bring the system, the school and the whole education system to the children, and they can make it work or make it fail with their role and their capability and how they function and how they behave. And this is where I think this region has a particular sort of colonial legacy which continues, which is that anyone can be a teacher with a college degree and doesn't have to be professionally prepared, and they are professionally prepared after they're employed. And this is certainly true in Bangladesh and in general true in the region. Then they go for a year or so of pedagogy, professional training. But the problem here is that, first of all, you make the selection of teachers, and teaching is not the choice profession of college graduates. So you first bring them into the teaching profession, and then you give them some training. And the training cannot compensate for, cannot overcome the basic level of quality and capability and intellectual sort of capability of the teachers. This has to come with the initial selection. And so how do the rest of the world do? In general, it's a professional development program after higher secondary for a 4-year period, along with regular college education. And then they learn the subjects, and as well as the prepare for a profession like all other, important or regular professions like a doctor or lawyer or engineer. They have to go through this process. It's only the teachers who don't have to be professionally prepared in our regions in this manner. And they're first employed and then given some training. So
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. If I may.
All right. I will in a minute or so. All right. So this is a challenge which we need to give more attention. I think this may be a way to bring together different kinds of problems by focusing on the professional development of teachers. Now, I think I'd like to make 2 more comments quickly. One is this regional report, of course, has tried to look at the situation now, analyze and understand the situation now in the region, and trying to do a regional report. Of course, it homogenizes the problems a little bit. You know, we have to bring out the general sort of least common denominator kind of thing of the problems. The granularity of issues and problems are lost a bit. And then also in recommendations. Again, the recommendations we have are very broad and probably cannot be avoided in a regional report. But then what do we do now? I think as countries, we have to take these as kind of takeoff and see how these things actually work out, play out in our own countries, and what are the other challenges that may be there in our countries, and then see what we need to do in terms of looking ahead, looking to the future. I think this can be a kind of takeoff for the planning and priorities and strategies that we have to engage in. So thank you very much. Let me finish here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for really being so comprehensive with your response. I wanted to now return back to Rahul. I know you have to leave. Just back to what Dr. Ahmed was concluding on, could you maybe make a few remarks on your views on how we can and should collaborate further across countries in education in our region?
So I think while the countries have their own differences, it's very interesting to me that there are actually a lot of commonalities across South Asia. And I think it would be very useful to learn from institutional arrangements and structures that are put up in certain countries that have worked there. Because again, I think just from a context perspective, each country is closest to the neighbors, even the ones that we do not believe that there are. But I do believe that our education systems, our governance systems are relatively so close to each other that something that works or does not work in one region is similarly quite likely to work or not work in the other. And there is a substantial amount of cross-learning that can happen. And I really look forward to more regional collaboration of that nature.
Thank you so much, Rahul. Let's now turn to Ms. Kiran Bhatti. And perhaps, Kiran, you could, again, give your take on the important issues and maybe also link it to your research and how you think the research you've done should and can help move education progress in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya, and I join the others in congratulating you for bringing out this very timely and comprehensive report, which I hope will fuel further conversation along these terribly important issues. As far as the India stories and concerned, I mean, I agree with Rahul, and I think that Dr. Ahmed has very comprehensively laid out the main problems that most of all of this entire region, and I think it includes India, are facing today in terms of challenges which are related to quality, equity, as the report also emphasizes, and the overarching theme which keeps coming up, and that is of state capacity. I think the entire region has seen a huge increase in demand for education, even from the most, or especially from the most marginalized, which the state has not been able to sort of cope with in terms of adequate quality. And I think that is one of the reasons that has created space for the non-state. And as the non-state has increased its footprint, there has also been exit from government schools of the better offs, creating problems for equity and a divide in the system, etc. We know that narrative. But I just want to take this, so I don't want to add to what has already been said. I agree with most of it, but I think one of the things, and again, I think the report maybe did not emphasize as much, and I'm kind of looking ahead, and I agree with Dr. Ahmed that we were talking about, looking at what is the situation currently. And of course, quality of which learning outcomes is a large part of the narrative on quality. And it is absolutely true But I think we need to also, and I think this is a challenge that we are now facing, is to unpack this idea of quality in learning. And I think that a lot of it has got sort of reduced to very minimalistic sort of qualifiers or indicators of learning, just basic literacy and numeracy. And I think here, unfortunately, the private sector or the private sector part of the non-state has contributed a bit to that narrative and really needs to relook at it. And we are forgetting, you know, we do keep talking very rhetorically about the larger public goals of education, but reducing education to visible outcomes of basic literacy and numeracy is actually taking us away from the larger goals of education. And we do need to step back and sort of look at, reevaluate or redefine what we mean by quality in the larger interests of which we know that education has a very important role to play. For instance, you know, and especially given the kind of scenarios globally, but definitely in India, of deep divisions and polarizations, etc., we know that education is very much a part of the larger project of citizenship as well. It's not just about basic learning outcomes, but those indicators of education have completely fallen off the map. And because we are so focused, in a sense, on quantifiable and visible outcomes, teaching to the test, just meeting the minimum, so-called quality standards of learning is what education seems to be getting reduced to. And I do fear that that is not the direction we necessarily want to move in. And I think that the non-state can play a role it has, I think, played a somewhat unfortunate role in pushing the needle in that direction because of its focus on cost efficiency and quantifiable, indicators for education. A lot of the indicators which are part of the larger public goals are not so easily quantifiable or not so easily visible, but that doesn't mean they're not equally important. And equity is one of them. So I think that it is time that we brought some of those things back onto the table. In the last few years, with the surge in private participation in education, some of those goals have sort of become relegated to the sidelines. Even if when there is an acknowledgement of those, there isn't enough innovative, creative thinking about how to bring them back on. There is still a focus on tech solutionism. There is still a focus on cost efficiencies. And all of that is somewhere compromising equity and some of these other goals. And I think we do need to start thinking more creatively about how to expand our own thinking around this. And surely the non-state has a role to play, but I think that it needs to be brought in line with those larger public goals that we do keep talking about. But I think the private sector is its own goals, its own incentives and priorities are not entirely aligned with those larger goals. And there needs to be a conversation between the two so that there can be a way found where those goals are not lost in the bargain. So I think that is in a sense a challenge for the whole region. It definitely is a challenge for India, where we are seeing more and more space being given to private participants, especially in setting the policy agenda. And our report does mention that. And it is not to say that the non-state doesn't have a role, but there are two things that we see happening. One is that the non-profit part of the non-state has less and less of a role, and the profit or the private cooperation part is getting increasing amount of space on the policy table. And I think that's a skewed sort of influence, which we don't also know enough about. There is also lack of transparency as far as private sector participation in education is involved. We need much more research and information in the public domain about that, so that, wherever one can intervene and bring in a balance that is made possible. So going forward, yes, I hope that this report does, take the conversation a little bit forward and beyond some of the things that we have been looking at in the last few years. I think COVID has certainly pointed highlighted the equity issues. It has highlighted the limits of technology, for instance. We need to take that conversation forward, and I hope that this report will allow us to do that. Our own research on the regulation aspect, points to very similar issues. The fact that the larger goals are not factored in defining or making the regulatory framework. And I agree with Rahul there that it tends to be focused on inputs, but also focusing just on visible outcomes is equally sort of reductionist in a sense. I think we do need to bring in the other aspects into a regulatory framework. It is fortunate in a sense that we are at the cusp of putting into place a new national education policy, which talks, it has a whole section on developing a neutral regulatory system, which is, kind of common to both state and non-state, that those conversations are only beginning to happen. So I really, really do hope that this report and our paper in particular can contribute to that. We are certainly hoping to do that in the next few months by initiating, seminars and workshops in that direction.
Thank you so much, Kiran. I feel like you touched on so many issues. There is one thing I would like to comment on is that there's a lot of conversation we saw in our recommendations as well, that countries focus too much on inputs. So then the idea is that let's focus more on outcomes. It's just that, from the GEM report perspective, inputs, processes, and outcomes all are linked. So we need to make sure we focus on all of them. And Kiran also highlighted the issue of non-state actors and their alignment with the broader, public goals, and also their increased participation. No other country in the region is as facilitating for private participation as Pakistan. So we now turn to Ms. Seher Saeed from ITA Pakistan to provide her comments. And Seher, I would say the same sort of questions to you, but of course Pakistan has quite a facilitative PPP arrangement. Could you give us a sense of, the situation in the country, but also what you hope the study and your ongoing other work can help move education progress along in your country? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ria, for actually giving us the opportunity to speak at the meeting. So as you know that, Pakistan is actually facing a lot of issues, like, mentioned also by the other speakers in the region, that Pakistan actually faces the issue of both quality as well as access. And the issues actually have largely been unmet. And still, the government sector also has not been able to, support both the issues of learning and quality. And the state actually fails to support also the children, and still all the targets actually largely remain unmet. So as far as, the current report is concerned, and actually it's going to be a breakthrough because, for many years, private sectors actually has been here working really well in Pakistan, but the acknowledgement has actually largely remained very much fragmented. The non-state provision of education in Pakistan remains a weighted reach and actually growing space amid all the complex constraint that is largely understudied and often, sometimes also misunderstood. There's an unfortunate dimension given the scale, scope, and diversity of the non-state actors across the country, and juxtaposed against even more complex challenge of severely unmet services in education, which is a fundamental constitutional right since 2010. Given the inability of state education system to currently cope with the unmet demand of, so many kids not going to school, especially in Pakistan, like also mentioned by the other speaker, and half of them also not learning well at all. Still, of course, there's an urgency to support all partners, especially the non-state providers, to not just maintain the level of service provision, but to expand it through the many innovative and system-based options. So the non-state actor actually has seen a large growth over the years, and it has actually grown more than 50%. And now we do see actually non-state actors are actually booming in each and every aspect of education. And this also, the report chapter of Pakistan also seems to highlight many facets of non-state activity in the education sector, providing very much needed data and insight into the largest segment of Pakistan education space. So definitely, I guess we do see a breakthrough, but I guess the system, especially government in Pakistan, do face challenges of regulation, especially, and financing. And primarily non-state actors in Pakistan are actually, financed themselves, and there's no regulatory bodies for the last 3-5 years actually, working across the provinces. But now we do see the change. We do see that in some of the provinces, there are some regulatory bodies now to actually support the non-state actors in the country. And we do see them actually now providing them with some kind of regulation, also some kind of framework under which they can operate. So we do actually, see actually something happening. We do see a positive also outcome also coming through in Pakistan. And we definitely believe that now, with support from the report and with the policy recommendations now coming through, we definitely will try to engage as much audience as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seher, for both for your remarks and also the extensive engagement we've already had with you. Last but not least, we turn to Dr. Nisha Arunatilake who was the lead author for Sri Lanka. Nisha, I would ask you to again give us a short take on the situation of education in the country before, in the past and currently in the present. What do you think are the main issues regarding how non-state actors are involved? How do you think your research can move education progress in the country in its current state? And perhaps you can also speak to the value of the regional partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. So I first want to join the earlier speakers in congratulating UNESCO for bringing this very timely and important report. So as per my earlier speakers, Sri Lanka also is not on track to achieve the SDG 4 goals. This is despite Sri Lanka being often regarded as praised for its achievements in education, especially Sri Lanka has had a policy of free education for all from primary to university level, but it has not been able to provide free, affordable education for all in a given standard of quality. So because of that, we have seen, and also this free education for all policy doesn't cover preschooling children. So because of that, we have seen that the enrollment at the preschool level is very low. And also for a different reason, enrollment at tertiary level are also very low because the state doesn't have the capacity to expand education at the tertiary level. Because of quality reasons, we also see that although the primary level, the education participation is quite high, at the lower secondary and upper secondary level, children are dropping out of school, so which is a big concern. And these dropout rates are higher in rural areas and more than in urban areas. So we have also seen, I think, one thing that the other speakers didn't touch upon is that providing free education has become increasingly challenging because of technological change and globalization. So in order to make education relevant for the current workplace, it is important to bring in education in technology and new skills that are no longer possible at low levels of investment. So we see even in the labor market that the demand for skilled workers are increasing. We see in developed countries they are giving incentives to bring in skilled workers. So Sri Lanka is losing educated workers for those markets. So it is becoming even more important for the education to step up and improve quality so that everybody is able to take advantage of the changes that are happening in the labor market. So this current model of free education for all, it is, given the economic crisis that Sri Lanka is going through right now, it's quite evident now that we can't achieve the SDG 4 goals given the current model. So it is important to bring in the non-state actors and collaborate with them to achieve the goals. But the problem in Sri Lanka is because of this policy of free education for all, we really don't know much about what is going on in the non-state arena. So this UNESCO report, or participating in this report, allowed us the opportunity to investigate into what is happening and learn more about how non-state actors are involved in the education sector. But what we see is that there is very little information, first of all on the non-state participation in education. And also because there is little information, it is not properly regulated. So there are various actors working in various ways, and some of which are in positive ways, some in negative ways. So I hope, my hope for this report is that it will provide the basis for dialogues to take place in Sri Lanka. And I think this is a very good time for Sri Lanka for this report to come out, because the government is also looking into different innovative ways of achieving SDG 4 goals without, because they don't have the capacity to invest more in education, but with partnering with non-state actors. So I really think that this report provides the opportunity and the content for these discussions to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisha. We unfortunately don't have our Nepal partner, IIDS, here today, but on behalf of Dr. Joshi, Dr. Sharma, and Dr. Shrestha, who led the research for this topic, I just want to say that a comprehensive understanding of non-state actors by country experts really, it materialized with the national country study, and I think it would be actually quite nice to hear from experts in the room now, also who are Nepal experts, if you'd like to say a few words. But before we turn to that, I wanted to sort of open the floor, perhaps we could have the video of all of the partners on the screen. Perhaps we could ask the partners to speak a little bit, maybe give a 1-minute note on this last question that I had, which is, what are your views on how we can and we should collaborate further across our countries in education? Maybe a minute each, and we start with Manzoor.
Okay, thank you. I think something we should consider, I think didn't come out strongly maybe in the report, is that we cannot talk about state and non-state as kind of binary. I think the hybrid part of it, where the state and non-state are already working together. Many institutions, many programs are being supported. Like in Bangladesh, I think the statistics say that 93% of secondary schools are private, but they are, mostly supported by funding and a lot of management involvement. So I think it is this hybrid part which maybe offers an opportunity for looking at new patterns and models of partners and all other kinds of challenges. And we have, of course, limitations in the private sector, all kinds of equity and other issues, and even quality and management issues also. So how the hybrid area where the state and non-state can come together, financing and other kind of support within a framework, and that may be the opportunity for the future and how we focus on that. But we have to be careful that the negative elements of both private and government are not brought together in this new hybrid pattern. I think we have to look at the positive, the strengths of both the public sector and the private, and see how the strengths can be, further enhanced through this cooperation. So I hope that we really look at that from the issues that have been raised in the study and the further discourse that we can have at regional level and at the country level particularly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. To Karen, I'd pose the same question. And if you have any specifics on how we can and should collaborate further across countries.
I think one aspect of non-state that, is a little bit of a tangential maybe aspect is the involvement of civil society or communities with in the education sector, and I think that's needs to be explored more. And if there are good examples from other countries of how local communities have partnered with the state in, for instance, monitoring education services at the ground level, or in providing some form of support in terms of whether it is academic or other forms of inputs. I think those are collaborations that are being less talked about in a sense between state and non-state. And I think maybe if there are examples, I know that there are some examples from India, but if there are examples from other parts of the world, I think of the region, those would be good examples to build on. The other aspect is on technology. I mean, even though I think that especially after COVID, we have seen that technology, can lead to greater, divisions or, the whole digital divide issue. I think technology is nevertheless can play a very important role, for instance, in boosting the data systems. And I think this is again a common problem across countries in this region, is that we don't have enough data, particularly on the non-state, but even actually the state statistics are highly deficient in many ways. And I think that digital technology can boost that if it is targeted particularly at local levels. So for instance, in India, at the panchayat level, if one can have a system where we can have online inputting of data, which is regularly monitored by the community, where it is updated on a regular basis, so it can be made real time, etc. Those are good contributions that technology can make to the education sector. And any learnings that one can have on that from other countries, I think would be a great means of taking forward that collaboration. So I think, in terms of community participation, which is also part, in a sense, of non-state, and in terms of how technology can be leveraged at more local levels to improve transparency, improve community monitoring, those are areas of collaboration, I think, which would be very useful.
Thank you, Kiran, for stressing technology and data systems and local level engagement. Could I ask Nisha to provide those remarks as well on how we can collaborate across our countries?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, if Sri Lanka is to achieve these SDG 4 goals, we have to really rethink our model of education, make sure that all different partners in education work together towards a common goal under a common framework. But we have been used to this old model of publicly provided education. So we really need to, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel from scratch, we can certainly learn from the experiences of the other countries in the region so that we can adopt the best practices and model this new way of achieving the education goals. So I think in that regard, this report is very useful, and that's I hope that will be a main contribution of this report.
Thank you. I think lastly, Sahar, perhaps the same question, but in a different way. Is there any interesting example or issue you saw from other countries that are interesting to think through for Pakistan?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Priya. Like Ma'am Kiran also have mentioned that, in Pakistan also, we do see non-state actors actually, providing a great deal of support through edtech innovations. And like Ma'am Kiran's mentioned that they can be used for financing, I guess, or for better management system. I guess they can also be used for improving learning outcomes also, because they're creating very good content, which definitely can be used, especially for the marginalized communities. Like we have tested also in COVID-19 pandemic, when it hit that, many, of course, state institutions were unable to respond because they were not able to reach out to most marginalized communities, including the disabled and especially also the girls. So I guess, interesting examples, not only here from Pakistan, but also from other regions, can definitely support in order to, curb the crisis that actually, plagues the education system overall, and can better also utilize the effectiveness of the non-state actors across the region. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. I feel we've had such a rich and engaging conversation already. We have a few minutes before we break for lunch. I would just ask you if you'd like to ask any questions to our director, Manus Antoninis, regarding the findings of the report, or to any of the panelists. Please, stand up and introduce yourself and ask the question. And yeah, if I see a wave of show of hands, maybe we can take a few questions.
In 2002. So it's a really useful collaboration, and we're really great to see this consistent level of monitoring, first against MDGs, now the SDGs. And I think that is really useful. It's really pleasing to see the direction under Manus's stewardship, to see this expansion in thematic topics in regional debates. So I think that's all really useful. Coming to non-state education, this is an area which I was sort of leading on policy for the UK prior to coming to Kathmandu in 5 or 6 years ago, and I would say it is one of the areas that creates the largest amount of perhaps controversy in education, because it is quite polarized. There are some very strong views both for and against, and the extent of regulation. So I think certainly the tone that I've seen that this report, the global report and the regional report set, I think is the right one. Because I think, you know, certainly the UK government have invested a lot in some of these large PPP experiments in Pakistan, notably in Punjab and to some extent in Sindh. We've invested a lot in research in this area globally, and certainly the messages ring true about the need for sort of transparency, accountability. But I think that I would really sort of put this thing about that it's not binary, which I think one of the speakers mentioned earlier. And I think that's the key challenge, which is how do you get a better and more open collaboration. I was really struck visiting some schools in the west of Nepal, I think pre-COVID, where in a sense you had children attending some girls attending quite special catch-up learning classes that one of our Girls Education Challenge program was putting on. That was from 6 until 7 a.m. in the morning. Then the children, and they were starting so early, I learned, you know, it was dark pre-dawn while some girls were arriving, and they were going so early because they would then go to some private tuition classes that 2/3 of the children of this school were attending prior to the real public education classes starting at 10 a.m. So there was no lack of parental support, of effort from the children. But it did make you wonder sort of, you know, how does this all come together? Obviously, we have a lot of Nepal experts in the room who could comment more on the Nepal system. But certainly we've observed, you know, a growth in English medium streams within community and public schools, some of which have some charges associated with them. And I think that question about what do we want to get from education is a really important question. Certainly the UK is very much, you know, backing the coalition of learning and the importance of foundational literacy and numeracy. And it was interesting to hear, I think, Kiran from the panel, you know, rightly saying it's not everything, but as a minimum, I think parents, communities, teachers, children all have an expectation to come with a minimum level of foundational literacy, the ability to read, as is often said, if you can learn to read, then you can read to learn in later life, no matter what your context and circumstances. And that's one of the key equity constraints that we have. But parents, and I think communities, have wider expectations on children growing up with a safe place to learn, free from abuse, from harm. Obviously, you know, social behavior is incredibly important, as well as recognizing all those wider aspects of our world that we live in, be it climate change, be it technology. So, I mean, there is that larger aspiration of what we hope to learn. So certainly, I think the more, tolerance and understanding of the relative advantages. The final thing I think on COVID I'd just comment on is just that the purely private schools have been hit for 6. Often the governments in the region have been enforcing strict closures of schools. Some of those go against some of the global evidence that actually shutting schools did not spread the COVID pandemic, but had a massive negative impact on the children, but obviously also on all of the economic processes of schools, because the taxpayers, the governments kept on funding the public sector payroll, but obviously private schools, you know, then had a huge hit on fees. And obviously this may be affecting Sri Lanka now with its socio-economic crisis. So I do think that that's, you know, it's important that both sides, or where the sides come together in hybrid education, is really important. I would just like to again comment on a great report and also for the insightful comments from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I think we really would like to hear from Nepal experts, and please raise your hands and go ahead. Helen, and please. That too.
Namaste, I just wanted to ask a question. I'm not sure if this is happening in other parts of the region, but here in Nepal, the private sector, and we see what a huge role they play in pre-primary education. And here in Nepal, they're increasingly pushing for playgroup 1 year, nursery 1 year, LKG 1 year, upper KG 1 year, 4 years of pre-primary education. And my concern is that you then have 12 years of education. We've increased a bachelor's degree to 4 years of education, and we're pushing away the opportunity for disadvantaged families to actually go on, and a child from that family to go on and complete a bachelor's degree or an upper tertiary education by delaying their entry. And I feel as if there's an exploitation going on here by the private sector in the pre-primary area, because the teachers, as was mentioned, are being paid less, they're not graduates, and particularly in the pre-primary area. And I just wondered, is this a trend in other countries in the region? I mean, we see correct age entry in government preschool ECD, but not in private. And we see an increasing trend of, particularly in the cheaper, lower end of the private school system, to push this more and more years in pre-primary. So I just wondered, is that a trend in other parts of the region, or is that just in Nepal? Because definitely it's an issue here. Thanks.
There's one more question here. Could you please introduce yourself and...
I do not want to repeat what Anne mentioned, basically relating to the COVIDs. Second, one of the recommendations of this report is fulfillment commitment to make 1 year pre-primary and 12 years primary and secondary education. I'm interested to know whether we have done the analysis. Investment by state and non-state actors in education, and correlation between equity and quality. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? I just wanted to make a brief comment before I hand it over to Manos, that we had that IIDS campus national launch of Nepal, where the issue of early education was debated very heavily. And I think in the report we have highlighted the fact that early childhood education becomes another way to sort of start inequity earlier and earlier in the system. And this is very clear in Nepal, especially with that question of, you know, the range of sort of the sort of exploitation, or what do you call it, the underpayment of teacher salary, of teachers who work at the early childhood level, is very present in Nepal, and I think, of course, also in a lot of the other countries in the region. And to some degree, one of the points is that this isn't just about the education system, but it is about how the broader overarching ecosystem works for how teachers are paid, how women are treated, and so on and so forth. But thank you again for such a wonderful session, and I turn over to Manos maybe for his final reflections on the whole session, as well as to respond to these questions. Thank you.
And I know I am keeping you from lunch, so I'll be brief. Just a few responses to the questions made. Ian referred, among several other things, to the role of the development assistance to particularly better management of the state non-state relationship, Pakistan being a particularly well-documented case. I think the big, of course, question there is how some of these interventions can be sustained, and they're not isolated in some parts of a country or in some levels of education, but they are comprehensive to leave behind the capacity that countries need to manage this phenomena better. But let's also not forget that even development partners' ideas on this have evolved. For instance, we have seen, and the report documents, quite a shift from some institutions like the World Bank in the region having somehow softened their stance, which was very much in favor of expansion of private education to a bit more of a mediated arrangement. But also backlash from activists in some cases that have led, for instance, to the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank, deciding to stop funding for-profit education programs in compulsory education as a result of activism. that demanded an evaluation of whether this practice was reasonable. On the issue of ECC, I think Priya already mentioned that. In fact, we're talking today when the World Conference on Early Childhood Education is taking place in Uzbekistan under UNESCO's auspices. Indeed, this is an area that I think very much refers to observations I made earlier. Sometimes institutions pander to households' hopes and fears at the same time, and that results in sometimes pushing for activities that are not necessarily ideal or suitable for the age of the children. Language in particular, I think I mentioned, was one of those cases. And also, as I mentioned, the other example, ultimately pandering also to household and parents' ambitions for progressing through the education system faster and having the right foundations, without recognizing that there are steps in the education development of a child, and there's no need to put academic improvement at the core of very young children's education programs, which actually need a much more holistic perspective. On equity and equality, I think the main key message to retain, and that's more generally, and I think came also from a number of our panelists, who I would also like to thank for being with us today, is the issue of domestic resources. If you have not enough domestic resources, and if you do not fund the public education system accordingly, and therefore many people exit, then the whole dynamic and equilibrium of the system changes, because there's less demand also for improving the public education system. And of course that sometimes translates into a bit more populist perhaps cases, but quite real, where the children of civil servants being educating their children in a private school, and the debate that generates around the world, not just in South Asia, but is a reminder of that there are some issues here that are particularly prominent in South Asia, given the size of the private sector and enrollment. Somehow some of these issues are managed in countries where maybe 5, 7, 10% of children are enrolled in private institutions, but when it's 50%, the whole political economy changes, and that's exactly what we wanted to do by focusing attention on this region with this report. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, SAARC in particular, and all of you for coming here today, our panelists, and looking forward to those of you who might stay in the afternoon for some broader questions on education collaboration in the region. Thank you very much.